Let me introduce myself. I am Master William Shakespeare.
Okay, so you'll help me, yes? Okay, brilliant! Yes, by Joe's pancreas, that is fantastic! For the first time in months, I am officially in the flower! Yeah!
Shakespeare Goes Viral is a podcast inspired by Will & Co.'s project Bard in the Yard. Learn more about Shakespeare's life, writings, and key themes that inspired him. Listen to writer and director Victoria Gartner tell you a story like no other.
This is Will. I hope all's well. I will just mention one, which was the last performance of 2020 that I did, which was into almost the back end of September. The weather at that time had been pretty dreadful. We were well and truly into autumn, and it was really quite cold. But I had been booked for a performance down in Kent, and happily that day the weather changed, and it was the most glorious day. I'd been booked by a friend of mine, Emma, who had booked me for friends of hers who lived down in Kent. Sadly, one of whom, his name was Lee, had recently suffered a brain tumour and was clearly in a very, very bad way. And I performed to a small audience. I think there were only about 5. And Lee, again, had been a lover of theatre, and they were very excited about this. But I was aware of his condition, and we spoke beforehand. I spoke to his wife and Emma, and kind of told them about some of the content of the play, and that it went to some slightly darkish places and dealt with mortality, etc. However, they told me not to worry about that and to get on with it. And the performance was fantastic, and really well received again. But it was extremely poignant knowing that Lee was in a bad way, and that the play, particularly there were some speeches, Richard II, that was it, the Richard II speech that went and dealt with mortality beautifully, and the wonderful speech from King Lear towards the end as well. Anyway, there were several tears shed. What can I say? A few months later, I found out that Lee had died, and it made that performance all the more poignant, and I don't know, it sort of tugged at the heartstrings somehow.
I say that, but here I am trying to write a comedy, and all I can think about or speak about is these dark times. Oh, my Jove's crusty elbows, it is so difficult to break out of this mood. We've all been so sad for so very long now. I mean, grief has torn us apart. It does that, grief. Grief fills the room up of my absent child. And to top it all off, we're afraid. We're afraid of the very air that we breathe.
Episode 4, Shakespeare and Tragedy.
When we think of Shakespeare again, one of the first things that come to mind is To Be or Not to Be. It's Hamlet. It's one of the biggest questions of our time. It's one of the biggest plays. Hamlet is the play on which the most criticism has been written. Criticism in academic sense of the word, in the sense that it has inspired artists, academians, historians, people, commercials for many, many centuries now. It's always very complicated to draw parallels between Shakespeare's life and his works. But it's also incredibly tempting, isn't it? It's something that is natural for us to want to do. It's also actually hard not to in this case, because Shakespeare's son, who was Judith's twin, called Hamlet, died when he was 11. And losing your only son, losing an 11-year-old child, is obviously a great tragedy in your life. Now, how he would have dealt with that, we don't know. What we know is that he wrote a play called Hamlet, in which a son loses his father. One of the big, lovely, legendary rumours about Shakespeare is that he would also sometimes act in his own shows. I like to think that he was quite bad at it because he must have been bad at something, right? Come on. In my head, the company kind of couldn't really say no, because equally that guy was writing all the plays, but they always gave him like a small part. So we do strongly believe that he would have played the ghost in Hamlet. So he would have played the father of Hamlet, and they would have been separated by death.
My father died during the time, and of course my boy, my son Hamlet, we had twins, you see, Judith and Hamlet. They were named after neighbours down the road, and Hamlet was 11 when during hard times we taste grief harder. I know his sister wasn't the same after that, but I guess none of us were. But we're in the business of storytelling. So I used it. I used my anger, my grief, and my confusion that children are allowed to die. I used it all and I put it in there.
There's a lot of ghosts in Shakespeare's plays. A lot of ghosts who want to come back. There's a lot of twins. It's beautiful. Twins just, are found in his works in a way that aren't in a lot of other people's works. It's a very specifically Shakespearean trope, twins. And Twelfth Night, again, the beginning of Twelfth Night, in the shipwreck, when the twins are separated, Viola believes her brother is dead, and she has to make a life of her own now. And we also believe the brother is dead, and then we forgot the brother ever existed and that he's alive, because in the play, we only catch up with Sebastian like 3/4 in. You start this play, you're really involved in Viola's story, and then 2 hours later, you're like, oh yeah, that guy's here. But he really kind of re-emerges from the dead,
We want to see lives bigger than our own. It's why I write a lot about kings and queens. For heaven's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing at his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene to monarchize, be feared and kill with looks, infusing him with a self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable and humid thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle walls, and farewell, king. Cover your heads and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty, for you have but mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king?
I think there's several ingredients that make up a Shakespearean tragedy. There's royalty, right? So it's often about the problems of the great people of the world. It's always about a king, a king, a queen, someone in power. And there's a reversal of their situation. So King Lear starts as this really powerful king and descends into a homeless person. There's a deep, deep reversal. There's betrayal. There's a lot of betrayal from people very close to you. Revenge, murder, gruesome, gruesome bloodshed. You know that scene where Gloucester gets his eyes popped out of his skull? I mean, that is, whoa, you know. It's very, very gruesome, bloody, and it looks torture in the face in a way that, again, Elizabethan society could imagine, you know, from the Tower of London was a scary place where everybody got tortured galore, and you could see it from the globe. You could see it standing on the riverbank. It's right there, just looming over you. So, bit of torture, bit of bloodshed, betrayal that leads to revenge. Revenge is a big thing as well. And then with revenge comes a cycle of bloodshed that sometimes is stopped by the end of the tragedy, but sometimes isn't. It's the great questions. I think another very important part of Shakespearean tragedy is that it asks the biggest questions that in our human life, in our human organized society, we can possibly ask. You know, what does it mean to have power? What does it mean to lose power? What does it mean to kill somebody? What does it mean to go to war? What does it mean to commit murder? You know, all those big, big, big Greek questions that come up in Shakespeare's works again, but in a way that is just, you know, incredibly deep, incredibly profound, stimulating, complicated, unanswerable. And that's also something that makes them still interesting to this day, is because they ask questions that we don't have an answer to.
To come back to King Lear, can you tell a little bit of the actual story and what makes it so interesting beyond the themes you just mentioned?
So King Lear starts like a beautiful fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a king. He was getting old, and he decided to split his kingdom amongst his 3 daughters. Now, he decides to split it based on how much each of his daughters love him. I mean, it sounds like a great idea. Does it? I don't know. It sounds like a great idea, right? So he thinks, the one who loves me the most will get the biggest bit. The first daughter shows up and he's like, oh, I love you so much, Dad, blah, 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 blah. She gets a big chunk of the kingdom. Second daughter shows up. Oh, I love you so much. I love you more than my husband. He's like, oh, yeah, like that. You get a big chunk of the kingdom. The third and favorite daughter, Cordelia, shows up and goes, let me actually read you what she says. That will be better. I'm going to do it like this. This will be. So, the third daughter shows up, and King Lear says to her, now our joy, although our last and least, to whose young love the vines of France and milk of Burgundy strive to be interest, what can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak. Cordelia says, nothing, my lord. Nothing? Nothing. Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again. Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more nor less. He's very unhappy with that answer because he wanted to be flattered. Now, he completely disowns Cordelia. She still finds a husband because they're chilling around. At the time, Burgundy and France were 2 different kingdoms. So they're still there. She gets married to one of them, even without a dowry. And they flee to France. Now, King Lear has split his kingdom in 2 between his 2 other daughters, Goneril and Regan. And, obviously, everything they said was flattery. So, he split his kingdom, he wants a nice retirement, he goes to one of his daughter's houses, and she grows a bit tired of having her old dad just hanging out. So he goes to the other daughter's house, and she's just a bit, you know, all his nights are loud and unruly and take a lot of space. I think ideally, you know, they would just like to send him to a retirement home, but he won't go. So he, in a final kind of act of rebellion, but also dismay at how much his daughters actually lie to his face, right? He goes out with his fool during a storm and sleeps outside on the wild moor. And that, gives rise to a very famous Shakespearean speech in King Lear that all good drama school students will encounter on their second foray into Shakespeare. Blow, wind, and crack your cheeks. And by the end of the play, he realizes that his youngest daughter was actually the most faithful because she loved him according to her bond, like a daughter should love a father, no more, no less, but no less. And there's war, and there's betrayal, and then there's Edmund, and a subplot with the guy called Gloucester who gets his eyes popped out. And it's a beautiful scene in which, so Gloucester also makes the mistake of believing his evil son over his good son, and his good son becomes a homeless person, lots of people hanging around on moors. And eventually Gloucester gets his eyes popped out of his skull. He's blind, he's walking out, he just wants to end his life and to drop off a cliff. And his young son Edgar finds him wandering around in the wild. And in a heartbreaking scene, he pretends to lead the blind man towards a cliff. And he, with his words, describes all this incredible, atmosphere and lets his father think he's jumped. I mean, how heartbreaking that must be, right? Like, realizing that your father wants to kill himself. By the end of it, there's a big war. Unfortunately, Cordelia is taken prisoner, just as King Lear. They go to prison together, and then she gets killed. And that's the enormity of the tragedy of King Lear, is that by that point, which is, the 5 last minutes of the play, her death is meaningless. She didn't need to die. She didn't need to die, and yet she does. And that breaks the old man's heart, and he dies of a broken heart. For a long time, I didn't understand King Lear until a few years ago. I think I kind of got to know it better, and I matured a little bit as well. And then a few years ago, Gregory Doran did a wonderful production with the Royal Shakespeare Company where Anthony Sher was playing King Lear. And I cried for about 2 hours in that production. But that heartbreak, that moment where he comes out with Cordelia in his arms, dead. King Lear was a play that was performed a lot right after the 2 world wars, back when art was all about unspeakable violence and just the enormity of how far humans will go to hurt each other and how desensitized we can become to compassion. King Lear really is the embodiment of that, and an exploration into the depths of human violence.
How did you use these elements to tell another story, or maybe to tell the story of our humanity?
I was stuck with this meme going, Shakespeare wrote King Lear and Macbeth in plague quarantine. I picked King Lear just because it was the first on the list, right? I asked myself that exact same question. I was like, how on earth am I going to make the process of writing this funny? So I decided to very helpfully inspire myself from a wonderful passage in Shakespearean Love. In Shakespearean Love, there's a wonderful scene where Shakespeare and Kit Marlowe meet in a pub. And Kit Marlowe, they're both played by very dashing, handsome, English actors, and with wearing leather and being sexy in the pub. And Marlowe turns to Shakespeare and is like, so, sup, what you writing on these days? What's going on? And Shakespeare goes, oh, I'm writing this great comedy, Romeo and Ethel, the pirate's daughter. I always loved that joke. And Marlowe goes, good title. And I just love it. So I thought, you know what? What if, because it was a time of plague, he also wanted to be uplifted? So what if he starts to write it as a comedy? So in King Leonardo, Shakespeare's trying to write a comedy called King Leonardo. And by the end of the 1 hour show, I know I don't want to reveal too much, right? But by the end of the 1 hour show, he realizes that maybe, just maybe, this might not be so funny after all. But throughout the play, we do go through some comedic moments because I needed it. You know, we needed it. I needed it. And I didn't shy away from some of the darkest times either, because that's also what makes us connect with each other is sharing dark times as well as good times. But I decided to turn it into a comedy because otherwise, you know, it would have just been too depressing.
We're afraid of staying in one day more, the fences of our homes closing in around us like gilded cages. We're afraid of stepping out into the world, even after it has all supposedly ended. We are afraid of greeting our neighbours. We are afraid of hugging our parents. We are afraid of kissing our lovers, afraid of what it might bring. We are afraid of each other. And that is the greatest tragedy of all in this, because I've missed you. I don't even know you, and I have missed you. I've missed this. I've missed us.
But the whole thing you said about being connected to each other, I find it interesting because it's also because of the tragedy in the drama that it still resonates today with what we're going through today. The world isn't going very well. We do connect with Shakespeare.
Again, a lot of primal emotions in Shakespeare, and he puts his characters in the most horrendous situations in tragedies. Some Shakespearean tragedies are incredibly hard to stage. Because, right, in Titus Andronicus, right, first scene, there's about 17 murders. How do you begin to start acting that by the end of Titus Andronicus, you've seen a woman raped and then having her hands and tongue cut out as if that wasn't enough, and then more killings. Titus cuts his own hand off, sends it to, then his 2 sons get killed. He gets his sons' heads delivered to him, and then by the end of it, he kills other people, puts them in a pie, and makes their mother eat them. Like, where do you know?
Game of Thrones.
Exactly. It's very Game of Thrones-like. It's sensational violence, but portrayed in a truthful way. I think Shakespeare's strength is never shying away from extremes. He always will push something to the very end of where it could go. Romeo and Juliet don't have to kill themselves. They don't have to. You know, at the end of Hamlet, same thing. There's about 17 bodies on the pile and on the floor, on the ground. And thank the gods, this Horatio is still hanging out, just able to tell the story to all the conquerors who stormed the palace with no resistance whatsoever because everybody's too busy killing each other. I think a lot of the violence in Shakespeare is a cautionary tale. He's always showing us what happens when you give in to violence, what happens when you push that boundary, when you cross that threshold into barbarity. We live in an incredibly violent yet sanitized world, whereas Shakespeare lived in an incredibly violent but smelly world. And we're fascinated by it. Whether we have been in direct contact with violence or not, we'll have the impulse. Just like we have the impulse to love, we have the impulse for violence. And it's scary. And it's something we'd rather keep hidden, which makes it fascinating. And yeah, Shakespeare is that. Shakespeare is the Netflix of his day. And he is competing against incredibly violent entertainment. Right next door to the Globe, there's the bear baiting pit, where it's the same shape, same building, same shape, except instead of plays, you get to see bears, like actual real life, the animal, the bear, bears, fight each other off, or it's bear versus bear, or it's like bear versus a couple of dogs, or bear versus leopard, And you just see animals fight each other to death, right? Not very far, from the Roman games. Entertainment used to be incredibly violent. All of Greek tragedy is just endless, purposeful violence, And then you have the Roman theatre, which is not really theatre as much as it is just execution of prisoners disguised as entertainment. And Elizabethan theatre is very much heir to all of that in a very direct way. The shape of the buildings is the same. And that's quite interesting.
I want to write entertaining, accessible stuff. I don't want to write plays that are only read by scholars who have to study years to understand what's going on. I want to write blockbusters that fill the playhouses. Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his conceit that, through her working, all his visage wanned, tears in his eyes, distractions aspect, a broken voice, and his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit, and all for nothing. For Hecuba. What's Hecuba to him, or he to Hecuba, that he should weep for her? Would that he had the motive and cue for passion that I had, he would drown the stage with tears, make mad the guilty and appall the free, confound the ignorant and amaze indeed the very faculties of eyes and ears. Yet I, a dull and muddy metalled rascal, peak like John a dreams, unpregnant of my cause, and can say nothing, no, not for a king, upon whose property and most dear life a damned defeat was made. Am I a coward? Who calls me villain? Breaks my patercross, plucks my beard off, and blows it in my face. Oh, vengeance, fie upon it! About my ears I have heard that guilty creatures, sitting at a play, have, by the very cunning of a scene, been moved presently to the soul, that they have proclaimed their malefactions. The play's the thing, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king.
We need it. We especially in our current world where we live with so many repressed feelings and emotions. We repress everything because everything needs to look a certain way more than it needs to feel a certain way. We're a society of appearances and we're losing our substance. And art is where we find that substance again, is where we find that bone and marrow and gritty thing. And one of the things I love about Shakespeare is that kind of down and dirt kind of emotional mush that he embraces. It's very sensual world, the world of Shakespeare. Everything has a smell, has a taste, has a feel. There's all of your senses are constantly engaged and called upon. And that's just really joyful because we tend to want to be polite and quiet and to fall in line, right? And Shakespeare's the complete opposite of that. It's just an explosion of humanity and a release, an emotional release, an acceptance of what it is to be human in a way that is visceral.
So hello, my name is Constanza and I'm an actress and a circus performer based in London, but I'm originally from Chile. That is in South America, just in case. So I performed for Bard in the Yard during the summer and it was great. And my favorite experience was when I went to this care home with lots of lovely old people. And after I performed, I stayed behind to have a chat with them, don't worry, with the appropriate distance, of course. And one of them, who used to have a very big job on the BBC, said that he wished that stuff like this would happen everywhere. Like impromptu Shakespeare, if you want to. Because for him, that's how it was meant to be. I mean, Shakespeare was a playwright that performed and lived amongst prostitutes, bear wranglers, the plague, and suddenly Shakespeare belongs to the BBC and is performed in really posh theatres with really posh accents, and where the people that it was written for has no access to it. And even worse, these days, those people think that they're not even good enough to understand it. And I totally agree. I think it's Shakespeare for the masses. But it was a great experience.
Thank you to Alex Dunmore, Constanza Ruff, Hannah Young, Henry Sharnock, Honey Gabriel, Jonathan Blakely, Jonathan McGarity, Keith McGuire, Will Harrison-Wallace, Charlie McKellar, and all the other bards. King Leonardo is being performed by Rupert Sadler. The Scottish play is being performed by Luke Farrugia. This podcast is produced by Will & Co. and La Souris Verte and supported by the Swiss Cultural Fund UK. My name is Zelda Chauvet. This is Shakespeare Goes Viral.